Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Backed by popular demand, or rather, because I wanted to do it, Two Idiots Discuss Sports, Baseball Lockout Edition. That's right, ladies. Baseball Lockout Edition. Please listen anyway. Will we or will we not get baseball this season? All of that and more. Let's get underway.
Act 1, Two Idiots Discuss Sports, Baseball Lockout Edition.
Due to overwhelming fan request, specifically from all my female listeners, please welcome Brian back to the podcast in an episode entitled Two Idiots Discuss Sports, the Baseball Lockout. Brian, how are you?
Mr. Patrick, I'm fantastic. It is a beautiful day in the East Coast right now, 65 and sunny, everything good. I don't know if the popular demand thing is that accurate, but I'll take it. You know, it's been a long, cold, dreary winter with no baseball, and yet I still seem to be purchasing Braves World Series paraphernalia at a clip unlike any other known to man.
Well, I don't fault you for that because I, given the opportunity, would very likely purchase many a piece of Mets paraphernalia if they had won the World Series or if they ever will win a World Series. And from a budgetary standpoint, that is frightening, but in a greater sense, it's also comforting because I don't think the Mets are going to win a World Series anytime soon, and therefore my budget will remain intact.
Yeah, your budget, your retirement is going to remain intact for quite a while. The Metropolitans are the Metropolitans, and we'll see what happens. You know, they've actually, since our last conversation, we're making some fairly decent moves, I think. Cohen may have reined himself in for a bit. I haven't seen much on the social media recently from him, but we'll see what happens with it.
Well, I'll give him this credit, and you just brought it up. He hasn't run his mouth on social media. Maybe he's learned his lesson. I've got to be more optimistic. You know, the new Patrick being more optimistic and trying to think greater than his environment. And the environment when it comes to the New York Metropolitans is usually an outhouse and you're down in the shithole. Cohen has been relatively active and quiet. I think Buck, the Schoenwalter hire is an excellent hire for that baseball team. I don't know that it's not going to result in the same kind of disappointment that the man's experienced. He's got kind of a Marty Schottenheimer type background, history, CV, curriculum vitae, if you will, in the playoffs. You know, maybe this is his year. Maybe he's the Andy Reid of baseball. He's going to break through after all these years.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, you know, Buck's he's one of the lifers, right? He's been around. He's done a lot of things. Did a decent job in Baltimore, but they still didn't do any of the winning. You know, you can look at that and, you know, as much money as the Orioles could spend, will an extra $4 or $5 million spent, you know, amount to more than 2 or 3 extra wins in a season? And, you know, that being said, if you've got the Yankees, you've got the Red Sox, and you've got the baby Blue Jays up, that's a pretty tough order to fill right there.
Yeah, and you and I being from the East Coast, being from that area, we know that Peter Angelos, as much grief as I've given to the Wilpons, he gets a pass because he's not in New York. Peter Angelos is certainly the equal to the Wilpons in baseball. Any other, I mean, Dan Snyder for the, whatever the hell they're calling them, the Generals, atrocious football name.
Commanders.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Commanders. You being from that area, I know you're not necessarily tied to that team from a fandom standpoint, but just how laughable is it What kind of schadenfreude do you get out of talking to get off of baseball for just a second? The run-of-the-mill Northern Virginia Washington Commanders football fan when that was the name that they chose?
It's a mixed bag. Some like the name, some love the uniforms. I think it's something, right? You got to take that as some sort of distraction away from everything else going on inside the organization with Mr. Snyder. There's a whole nother episode we can do on that one.
That's true. And perhaps I might have to invite you back and bring JB on, and Nolan if he'll do it. And that's all. I'll only use that one name to provide or to protect identities. But I would like to bring in an older Virginia crew to talk about what's happened to the once glorious Washington Redskins. But let's get back on topic. No spring training. Me being a resident of the Valley of the Sun, this is very disappointing for the local economy. It's also very disappointing for my social life. I want to go to at least 3 or 4 spring training games because of where I live and the proximity that I have to one of the stadiums. It's very, very easy to get over there. Your thoughts on the likelihood, well, first of all, your take on the lockout and the likelihood that we'll have any spring training.
So with the lockout, there wasn't an agreement done. I mean, this lies fully on the backs of the owners, right, to actually do a lockout. Now, when this thing happened in December, Manfred had the audacity to come out and said this is going to essentially escalate the discussions, right, to hopefully get something done very, very soon. That being said, we're 2.5 months later, and we are nowhere near where we need to be to have any sort of agreement done. So this could have been done without these conversations, this negotiation could have been done without a lockout. They could lift the lockout right now, get everybody into spring training and continue the discussions. If anything, you've got most everybody in the same location at that point, right? So I think it falls squarely on the owners. Manfred was brought in as the commissioner because he deals with labor negotiations. As an attorney, he's dealt with these things. And yet we're not anywhere closer than we were. In fact, some of the things that he said have just been atrocious. So the fact is, we were supposed to be in spring training right now, right? Pitchers and catchers were supposed to report this week. This past week, we've got games that are supposed to start on the 26th. Baseball came out, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, and officially postponed those at least a week. So we'll see what happens. All I want to see is baseball. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge we have right now. Much like children in a divorce, the fans are the ones taking the brunt of this thing. And it's all because of the bickering that they just can't seem to agree on. And, without getting into the minutiae, as you and I were talking about a minute ago, without diving too far into the minutiae of everything that's going on, they're pretty far apart. And, it all comes down to money. And it's, if we dive a little bit deeper into that, it's atrocious. It's not good. And, I always go to about October, November. There's a website I jump on. I just go to the Google machine and type in spring training countdown. And I just did that a few seconds ago. And unfortunately, the countdown says we've got 356 days till spring training of 2023. So hopefully we don't have to wait that long, but something's got to happen. Good news is that they're meeting every day this week. It's been at least 3 to 4 hours today, which is about 2 hours and 45 minutes longer than their last meeting, I think. It lasted 15 minutes. So hopefully they can get something hammered out this week and we can get back into spring training or at least get back on track by next Monday.
Well, I love your optimism, first and foremost. And I want to feel that way. But based on something that you alluded to earlier, Manfred is, in fact, a labor negotiation lawyer. I think it was calculated that he comes out, makes a public proclamation about how they're going to approach the new labor deal with the Players Association so that they could avoid this very situation and then turn around and manufacture it. In my mind, this is all the owners, and they are manufacturing this situation in order to put pressure on the Players Association to take a bad deal. I am concerned that based on some of the things that the players have said, and again, don't want to dive into minutia, that's something that we discussed prior to actually starting the recording, but based on the position of many of the players, it appears, and again, appearances can be deceiving, particularly in a labor negotiation, but it appears that many of the players, the rank and file, are ready to suffer, and I use that word deliberately, are ready to suffer to get the right kind of deal that they didn't accept 10 years ago. So I don't think we're going to have spring training, and I think we're going to lose games in the regular season as well until the owners realize the extent to which the players are willing to suffer. And when they realize as much, and they start to look at their bottom line, because like you said, this is all about money. This has nothing to do about ethics or morals or, the grander good. When all of those stadiums are empty and a lot of the ancillary places around those stadiums, and we're going to get to that'll be the next topic, but all of the ancillary places around the stadiums, the bars, the restaurants and whatnot, that many of the owners now have an interest in, when those places are empty, then the owners are going to come to the table and say, okay, now we're going to put together a better deal. Because that ancillary money is just as much a part of their calculus as any of their bullshit numbers that they put out about the day-to-day operation, the profit and loss of the baseball team.
I agree, and it's interesting. I was running through some numbers earlier today. The Braves are owned by a company by the name of Liberty Media. Liberty Media actually also owns SiriusXM Radio, ironically enough, but they're also a publicly traded company. And what's very interesting about that is all of those numbers are there in print for anyone to go see. And ironically enough, they're not posting any fourth quarter numbers until this coming Friday. Whether it's on the purpose or not, during negotiations this week. But if you look back at their third quarter numbers from 2021, and this number's been out there for a while. Obviously, they reported these back in November, but their revenue in the third quarter of 2021 was $234 million attributed to the Braves. And that was through the end of September, way before any of the postseason came in. Now, compare that to 2020, where it was only $110 million, and obviously there was an issue with that. That was the COVID year, right? But essentially, through that third quarter, you want to talk money and losing games. The per game revenue for Liberty Media in the third quarter of 2021 was $6.5 million per home game.
It's amazing.
$6.5 million per game. Now, that does include a lot of ancillary stuff, right? If anybody watched any of the World Series, specifically in the games that were in Atlanta, the Braves built this entire compound called the Battery, which it owns all the land. Significant interest in many of the establishments there, high-end restaurants, middle restaurants, bars, beer joints, whatever you want to call them. But those places were absolutely slammed throughout the World Series and through September and October. But just in the third quarter, $6.5 million per home game. Compare that to what they're actually paying players, with a total salary of about $170 million, I think the number was. So it's a very disproportionate number, and that's where it's all coming down to. It's the players saying, hey, listen, we didn't get that fair deal 10 years ago. We need something better, and it's not just, hey, we need this more for our salaries, but they're diving into this from a competitive standpoint. We talked a little bit about the competitive balance tax, exceeding these numbers. they have to, if salaries exceed these certain numbers, teams have to pay this excise tax over and above this threshold. But it's also talking about the minor leaguers, the younger players, making sure that those are taken care of. Talking about the tanking that's going on in baseball right now, talking about the fact that minor leaguers aren't getting taken care of, the fact that minor leaguers' contracts and services being manipulated to hold them back another 2 weeks, even though they're ready for the big leagues, because the team can have control of the contract for another year. All of these things are coming into play, and with the owners, it's about money. With the players in these conversations, there's so much more that they're trying to address because, as you mentioned, they weren't addressed 10 years ago in the last deal.
Right. And when I came into this podcast, when I was thinking about doing it, and you and I were talking about how we wanted to address it, the one thing that I did not want to do was come in and do a good guy, bad guy situation, because I think it's all too commonplace, this binary, if someone is doing something, it's either good or bad, and not trying to see the gray. But in that vain attempt, will already qualified, in that vain attempt, it's hard to see this position that the owners are taking as anything more than, we have lots of money and we want lots more money, and the easiest way to do that is to press down on the players and continue to keep them at bay when it comes to revenue sharing. You just made a very poignant statement that if you're bringing in $234 million in a quarter, now granted, baseball does not go all 12 months, but it's one of the longer seasons of any professional sport. We can both agree on that, and that's basically a fact when you look at a calendar. Let's say that we can only extrapolate that to 2.5 quarters, right? Well, you're looking at close to $700 million, if not exceeding $700 million. And you just said it for the Braves, it's $170 million in annual payroll. So what are you paying? You paying a quarter or 30 cents on the dollar to your players? That's not fair. Plain and simple, it's not fair. And that's only to the major leaguers. Like, the minor leaguers aren't getting dick. The minor leaguers, to hear the stories of minor leaguers that have been put out into the lexicon, whether it be social media or on interviews, 5 or 6 guys sleeping in some rat hole in Birmingham, Alabama, or in Albany, New York, right? Living worse than they did when they were in college, if they went to college, or worse than they did probably at any point in their lives, and then having to get up and get on a bus, a nice bus? No, not a nice bus. Drive halfway across the country to play these baseball games. It's a wonder that you don't see more injuries in baseball, given the way that these guys live, the lack of training facilities when they're in the minors, and how little money that they're getting paid. It simply isn't fair. The owners come off as ogres. It's hard to see this situation on the owner, or for the owners, right? What's the owner's viewpoint? How can we sympathize with the owners? I can't.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a really good point about the minor leaguers. And this is something I shared this with you. This Scott Boras, and we'll address him more in a few. Was on a podcast with the Braves beat writer Dave O'Brien, and was kind of walking through some of those things on those specific points with minor league baseball. And he made a good point. These guys don't have the best accommodations, right? They don't have the best menus. They in many cases worse than when they were in college, or definitely when they were at home. But the reality is, if you look at the owners of those minor league teams, now those teams are affiliated with the major league teams, but they're not owned by the major league teams, right?
That's correct.
However, they're also not paying those salaries. The major league teams are paying those salaries. Major league teams are paying for the managers and the coaches, right? What are those owners of those minor league teams doing? And shouldn't they have some sort of mandate where they've got to put up decent housing? They've got to put up a decent meal for these folks. And we're not talking about going to Ruth's Chris, right? But we're talking about a little bit better than the bologna and cheese sandwich. And that's really where it comes down to it is, there's so much money that's in there somewhere that's not being filtered down to the folks that are providing the actual entertainment. And I don't want to get into the good guy, bad guy thing either. I think that, you can do it on both sides. The players are obviously going to be are going to play hardball. The owners are going to play hardball. But we've got to have some sort of resolution and some sort of middle ground. And heaven forbid, with Manfred as the labor lawyer, they've got to come in with serious offers. And that's something they haven't done since this process started in December. There are so many other things that need to be addressed. Now, they have addressed the universal DH. That's a good thing. We're going to get the universal DH when the deal's finally done. We're going to get a few other things built into that. There's going to be a draft lottery similar to the NBA to try to keep teams from tanking too much. Now, obviously, there's still going to be some sort of tanking, but if you get every team that didn't make the playoffs into that lottery, now all of a sudden it's a whole different ballgame, right?
Right.
So we do have these positive things that are coming, but if you look at just the growth in revenue in Major League Baseball and compare that to this competitive balance tax, which, it's not an official quote unquote salary cap, but it's effectively a salary cap where if you exceed that level of salary as a team, you're going to have to pay a 20 to 40 to 50% penalty over and above that on what you paid. So if you went $10 million over, you're going to have to pay 40% in that in a tax. So you're going to pay $40 million in a competitive balance tax. That soft salary cap has grown disproportionate to the revenue that's been generated in Major League Baseball. If you look at 2019, actually, let's just start at 2003. Revenue in 2003 was at $3.8 billion. The tax level was at $117 million. Fast forward 16 years, that revenue was at $10.3 billion, and the base tax level only increased to 206.
It's amazing, right?
It's amazing, and the projections going to 2026, that level's only increasing to $222 million versus the $12 billion of revenue. So something has to change, right? And as much as ownership and Major League Baseball's cooking the books to say, hey, listen, we're poor, we don't have the money to do it, revenue numbers tell us different, right? You just look at the Braves third quarter, $234 million. Now, obviously, that's revenue, that's not net income. There's difference. But with those levels of funds coming in, specifically in the postseason, where in the postseason, the players no longer get any of the TV contract revenue. This was a big bone of contention back in 2020, is when they were talking about expanded playoffs, the players don't get any of that television revenue that they do get during the regular season. Playoffs, it all goes to the teams. Players get a portion of the gate, which, let's be honest, at $500 for upper left field tickets that I paid for last year, or $400 or what it was. That's a decent sized number, but it's not the TV money. And all of that is going to the teams. And if they're talking about expanded playoffs and reducing the amount of games in the regular season from 162 down to 154, that even gets more and more disproportionate.
Well, first of all, those are all great points. And I don't think it's well known that the players don't get a bite of the pie when you go into the playoffs as far as the TV money. And that's always, I follow the Premier League. You can look at the NFL. That's one of the reasons why you're always going to get pushback for playing extra games. It's how much money is actually going to come to the players and how is that pie distributed. And in baseball, you could see why the players wouldn't want to play more playoff games. They're not getting any of that money anyway. So Let's switch gears a little bit because you brought up the two names, and I want to discuss both of them, Manfred and Boris. So Rob Manfred, the commissioner of Major League Baseball, and Scott Boras, probably the number one, or at least the most marketable agent in Major League Baseball as far as notoriety and publicity. Let's talk about Manfred first, and we talked about this offline before we started the podcast. But the things that Manfred has said, and I pose the question to you, here we have a man who was an accomplished labor lawyer, takes the job on behalf of the owners. Everyone knows he's being hired because they're going to have a labor dispute coming up for the new collective bargaining agreement. Here we are, 2022. Manfred comes out and makes the proclamation, we're going to take a position so that we can get this deal done in December and avoid all of the problems associated with a drawn-out negotiation that bleeds into the season. From the moment he uttered those words, everything else out of his mouth has been either almost comedically stupid or two-faced, right? He's contradicted himself. And the question I posed to you offline, the question I pose to you now, is this a situation where the owners, and by way of their mouthpiece, we could call them the owners collectively, Manfred and the owners, by way of their mouthpiece, do they not understand how social media works in contrast to the traditional network media, in that anything that you put out there on social media now can immediately be fact-checked and can be verified because of the number of sources that are available and the number of people that are willing to do it? Or is it a simple, because of the position that we're in, we don't give a shit? We know that once we actually get a deal done, all of the things that we said and did will be forgotten. The fans will come back. So fuck you. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's, I think it's a chicken and the egg thing. It's the owners saying, hey, listen, you wouldn't be here without us. And the players saying, hey, you wouldn't be here without us either. So, looking at Manfred specifically, go back to the issues in the COVID year of 2020 and the things that he said there. And without actually quoting verbatim those lines, some of them were just absolutely idiotic. And for him to come out in December saying, hey, we're going to do this with the hopes that we're going to get this thing done quicker was just a bunch of BS, right? There was no way that this thing was going to get done quicker. You lock somebody out, they're not going to come running to your door saying, we'll do anything you can, just don't lock us out so we can still get our contracts done. That's not how it's going to work. And I think that they're in this spot right now, the players that, they are going to make sure they want to play, right? Without playing, they're not making any money. Players Union came out at the end of last year and said, hey guys, this is not the time to go out and buy that new Maserati with your contract, right? We don't know when baseball's coming back. We don't know when we're going to be in spring training. We don't know how many games we're going to lose. And for Manfred to come out and say these types of things, it just comes off as stupid. The fact when they decided that they were making a play to get a federal mediator involved, and one of the reasonings being, quote unquote, phones go both ways, it comes off as stupid. And so many things that Manfred has positioned has been awful. He did an interview, Dan Le Batard did an interview with him a few years ago where he just absolutely got laid out. And he may be a labor lawyer, but he really doesn't have the ability to have any filters or make sane comments even half the time. So yes, everything can be fact checked. It is stupid, but I also think from an ownership perspective, they do have this, we don't care. We're here. People will come back. When, more and more are saying, hey, listen, we may not come back. You look at the strike in 1994, they wiped out the last part of the season. They wiped out all the playoffs and the World Series. And so many people so many people still stayed away from the game up until the home run chase of what was it, 99 with Sosa and McGuire?
Yes, I believe it was 98 or 99.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what started people coming back again. But it's just this pompous attitude that's being taken right now. Again, as you said, I don't want to go good guy, bad guy, because I think it's a little bit of both on everything. But I think that the owners have looked worse based off of things that have been said by leader in charge, Rob Manfred.
Let me pose this question to you before we get to Boris, because I have this concern. You and I talked about this last season in the podcast, the fact that baseball doesn't resonate with a lot of younger viewers in the first place. We go half a season without baseball. God forbid, 80 games. It's almost the COVID redo, right? The redux. And we're playing 80 games, and people get used to the fact that they don't have baseball in June and July. How many people are going to come back? What is your concern about if people go through the beginning and the middle of their summer without any baseball? Will they learn to live without it?
I think they will 100%. I think that they're diehards. I'm still going to watch baseball. I'm gonna get the MLB package so I can watch Braves games on a daily basis, much to the chagrin of my wife. But what else is coming this spring? You got two. Speaking of redos, you got two redos, if you will, in the XFL and USFL. Now, it's minor league football. Neither of these leagues lasted the last time. But you've got football that's going to be coming back in the spring again, right? Is attention going to be diverted towards those? And nobody's really going to care about baseball for a while. I think there's that risk. I think that's something they absolutely need to take into account is people do have other choices. They have options. My wife and I are talking about, doing it, going to the Braves opening day. It's World Series ceremony at Braves opening day. And she says, well, let's go out and buy tickets. I'm like, well, let's kind of wait and see when that actually happens. Because we just don't know. If you talk about spring training and you talk about when games could start, the soft deadline they're talking about is the 29th. Players themselves said they need only 3.5 to 4 weeks to get ready so they could feasibly start on time. But if this thing continues to drag out, and baseball's not there coming to the end of March, could their attention be sent other places? 100%. Again, you got football. You got football coming back. Is it good football? I don't know if it's good football, but it's football. It's sports. It's the most popular sport in the country.
Well, and you make a good point as far as attention being diverted. If baseball isn't there as another option and people are watching football, a lot of people will be content with that. And they're going to have, as you just said, two different options for football because there's going to be two different leagues. Both of those leagues can't coexist. One of them is obviously going to kill the other. But the very fact that baseball won't be there to contribute to both of their deaths could actually cement one of those leagues surviving into a second season in 2023. Now, I don't want to be, this is going to come off as pessimistic or as judgmental. I don't care about either one of these leagues. Like you said, it's basically junior varsity football, and it doesn't matter that much to me. I am concerned because you are, I'm a diehard baseball fan, that if there's enough attention diverted to one of these leagues because there is no baseball, and now you have something competing with baseball that's very clippable. One of the things that the NFL is, one of the things that football is very clippable, right? So it can be put into these bite-sized pieces on social media in ways that baseball can't. That's concerning to me. Well, I want to switch gears because I think you and I are of the same mindset that Manfred is either a boob or he's doing exactly what he should because they think that we're going to come back no matter what. And like Roger Goodell, he's a great target, right? Let's go let Manfred be the punching bag so that the owners don't have to take that beating in a public setting. And yes, baseball is under threat if it doesn't actually get underway because of these other interests, the competing interests that people have, particularly in sport, but even outside of sport. Let's go to the final topic, and that being Scott Boras. And like I say, the universe wants to achieve, is want to achieve balance, is always striving to achieve balance. The balance here being that there are powerful media figures in sports agents that can take the player's case to the public on why this lockout is happening. You directed me to a podcast where Boras appeared, and it was quite humanizing. He gave his backstory about growing up in the Cardinals and the Cubs spring training system and then going to law school, getting involved in baseball only because he had the contacts within baseball from having played to help some guys with their contracts. Before you know it, this is his bread and butter. Let's talk about Scott Boras and the balance of the universe. He's always come off to me as douchey. He still comes off to me as douchey. But how necessary is that douchebag when he's in front of the camera to get the player side of the story out there?
I think he's incredibly necessary, as much to many people's chagrin. I think it's definitely necessary to have him out there. Now, it's interesting. I got a buddy of mine who's a huge Astros fan. We actually went to game 3 together when a couple of months ago when Carlos Correa signed with Boras. His response was, "Well, I guess there goes the hometown discount."
Right.
And he brought this point up on that podcast, right? If you're a team and you want your favorite player to remain a part of that team, and Scott Boras is the agent for said player, and said player goes somewhere else for $350 million for 10 years, you're not going to be a big fan, right? But and I'll let you bring this point as well. I mean, he does what he needs to for the people that have employed him, correct?
Exactly.
So I think it's necessary. And one additional thing to think about with Boras through this, obviously he's the big name as an agent in Major League Baseball. What I did not realize until I listened to that podcast was about his background, right? His background growing up in the minor leagues, the fact that he also went to law school. His salary in the minor leagues helped pay for that. And how he got into the agent realm was he started negotiating contract for buddies of his. So it's interesting to hear that from that background and how things have gone. He does what he needs to do to get his players what their worth is. But here's the other thing to think about as it relates to the current negotiations. Scott Boras also represents 5 of the 7 players that are on the Major League Baseball Players Association negotiating board. How much is he in their ears? And I'm sure they're leaning on him for some sort of advice, some sort of direction as to, hey, what do we really need here? Because many just may not know completely, or they may just not think of everything that's going to be needed. But the question now becomes is how much is Boras indirectly a part of those negotiations?
Well, I think he's instrumental in those negotiations. It's no coincidence that he is representing 5 of the 7 players on the advisory board, and you've got Manfred on the other side. So for all intents and purposes, you've got 2 lawyers yelling at each other, whether or not it's a divorce case or a criminal case or a personal injury case. Really, you've got these 2 lawyers yelling at one another. Hopefully, the owners and the players can get some of their interests met during the course of that negotiation. But, Boras is, in my mind, to use a analogy in sports, he's like Gloria Allred when she represented all of those women who brought the claims, if you will. Really, they just brought notices, but they brought claims against Tiger Woods. And had she not been able, with her media profile, to call those press conferences, who knows how that whole episode would have evolved or how much different it would have been, right? Because we have a very similar situation in the NFL with a quarterback from the Houston Texans who I did a piece on, who, by his word, just simply likes a nice massage. And without the high-profile lawyer representing some of the women who are making these claims, that whole thing has kind of died down. Now, he hasn't gotten to come back, and by the way, his name is escaping me. What's his name?
Deshaun Watson.
Deshaun. Deshaun hasn't gotten to come back and play yet, but as far as the fervor over what he did and how he's handling it with the women, it's all on the down low. We're not hearing anything about it. And that's probably to the detriment of those women because they're not getting as much money as they would if this were a front page story on ESPN for the next 30, 60, 90 days. So Scott Boras is certainly serving a function for the players and creating balance because otherwise I don't think the players' message would get out there to the same extent. Specific to the point that you made about Scott Boras and knowing a little bit more than some of these $100 million players would ever understand about the minor leagues and how money needs to be distributed, I think that's going to be one of the bigger sticking points between the owners and the players is now the players, even though they may not have come into the negotiation with this as one of their main negotiating points, are realizing that their brothers are sleeping on cots and that even the owners of the teams that they're playing for aren't really having to pay for the expenses. And now they're incorporating that into the negotiation. It adds additional levels of resistance, correct? There's more things to argue over and consider, whereas the deal 10 years ago or 20 years ago was really, hey, this is about major leaguers and the distribution of the profits. How much are we going to split? Now they're bringing into the fold, well, how much money are we going to allocate to the minor leagues? How much of an obligation are we going to create for the minor league team owners to at least provide decent accommodation for these folks and not give them the same food, the same hot dogs and hamburgers that they're serving to the fans during the game? Do you think that that is going to create another level of complexity here that's going to, unfortunately, eat into some of the games of the season?
It could. Is that the main sticking point through the lockout? And no, it's not. I think it's a subset built into it. But they now have the stage in order to address it, right? And we saw that last fall. Numerous reports coming out, and still through December, January, February. Reports coming out and accounts from minor leaguers of the conditions that they're in. And it's just disheartening. You look at it as a fan. I've lived in the Southeast a majority of my adult life. I was no more than 20 minutes away from any one, minor league ballpark, minor league team, and they're always fun to go to. Right? Those are Thirsty Thursdays. Those are the fun games to go to. Laid back, inexpensive. Go on a Tuesday night. Have a good time, watch some baseball. But then you realize these guys are making $12,000 a year, right? They're not making anything. They're living in very bad quarters environments, and not all of them, but a significant part of them. Those need to change. Again, look at the disproportionate growth of the revenue versus the salary cap or the competitive balance tax. There's money somewhere, right? In addition to that, they're talking about, there are players that are in the major leagues for 10, 15, 20 years. The Braves had a guy that got into a game this year, was 35 years old. He's played his entire career in the minor leagues. 35 years old, wife, 2 kids, not making a daggum thing of money. And that's part of this plan that Boris came out is if you have played for 3 years in the minor leagues, there's a bonus that you have access to, a $500,000 bonus, and that bonus isn't paid by the teams. The proposal on that is that's a bonus that's paid for by fines and penalties. Somebody gets suspended for 25 games because of PED use or whatever it might be. That money goes into that pool. And that in itself helps their brothers, as you say, in the minor leagues. But to give them something to work for, some sort of incentive to keep working and keep pushing forward. Because sometimes the environment that you work in just kills any motivation that you might have. We've all experienced it. And, is it the main sticking point with these negotiations? It's not. It's not going to be. But they at least have that. They have that platform now where they can address it.
Right. And I'm hoping they do address it because, like you said, we were ignorant as fans for so many years as to what the actual conditions were of the minor league players. And I, like you, went out on many a Tuesday, Thursday, sometimes a Saturday in the cities that I lived in that did not have Major League Baseball and went to see a minor league game. And they were always great. Now, the baseball wasn't necessarily the best, but part of the atmosphere is, you're watching guys who are either rehabbing from the major leagues or they're striving to get up to the major leagues. So you never know when you're going to see some kind of breakout star in those environments. So there is that opportunity to see something special. And if you don't, well, you're watching baseball. It's like having pizza. Even bad pizza is still pizza. So, Brian, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. I hope that you and I very soon can have a follow-up call and talk about the upcoming season. Although I'm not as optimistic as you, let's hope we can do that within the next month or two.
Glass half full, my friend. We've got the, if they can stay in that room together this week, they could feasibly hammer something out. But I agree with you. Let's definitely get it done preseason.
I love it. Thank you so much for your time, Brian.
All right, buddy. Talk to you soon.
Act 2, it's called gratitude. And that's right.
I want to briefly thank everyone again for listening, for supporting the podcast. I've gotten a lot of comments just over the course of the last couple of weeks with the new season, the new approach, the content of the new episodes, and I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to continue on this path, and I'm going to continue to invite this input because I think it's going to greatly help me communicate to you and hopefully grow the podcast in a way that's more inviting for a lot more people. As I have been instructed to do, and I'm going to make a habit of, if you haven't liked the podcast, please do. Please leave comments. Please write a review. Please go to my Patreon page. You can support the podcast monetarily for $5,000. It's not that much. I'm not asking for $50,000 or $60,000. I wouldn't do that. I'm not saying if you gave me $50,000 or $60,000 that I wouldn't accept it. I certainly would accept it. I just want to make it clear that I didn't ask for that much. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.